LSAT logic games, rule substitution questions. This is a topic that I'm asked about pretty often, all the time, in fact. And of course, I've given some brief advice in various contexts, but I haven't really done a deep dive on them yet. And so I thought that might be useful. So I'm sharing here a link to my page on my website with my write-up on rule sub questions, as well as a list of every single rule substitution question ever. They start with exam 57 and go all the way up to present. They've appeared on nearly every single exam since exam 57, which is June 2009, I think. So quite a while, nearly 10 years. When they first appeared, of course, that was quite a curveball. Since then, they've become a bit more routine, but because they appear so infrequently, even though they're nearly once per exam, they always seem kind of strange, and folks never really get the chance to get a handle on them unless they drill them. So in that article, I shared the link. My idea is drill those. The second link I've shared is a link to my slides for this presentation in Google Drive, so you can follow along. Obviously, it's a PDF, so you can save them to review later. Don't feel like you need to spend a ton of time taking notes on every little thing I share. The slides are there for you. Now, here are the slides. I've pulled up a screen share so we can walk through my thoughts on rule sub questions and how to approach them. So again, the topic, logic games, rule substitution questions, also known as rule equivalency or equivalent rule questions. Nearly every exam since exam 57, I've got the full link with the full list of them for you in that article. Now, approaches. Check the answer choices against your diagrams. And you want to ask yourself, does a given answer choice allow previously valid scenarios to still work? Does it impose new limits? Does it allow scenarios previously that were not permitted? So if it imposes new limits and prevents a previous valid scenario from working, it's no good. Alternatively, if it allows a scenario that previously would not have been okay, also no good. So you want something no more limiting and no less limiting. You want to eliminate answer choices that violate your valid diagrams. If it's not compatible with the main diagram and it's not compatible with local diagrams, eliminate it. It's no good. The correct answer choice must enforce all original constraints without adding any new ones. So this is general theory, general background. Obviously, we'll get into some examples tonight. I'm really excited about that. All of this is also on that article I shared. You also want to check for deductions and check against your deductions. Sometimes a given answer choice will reveal a deduction or inference directly, or when combined with your other original rules, it should lead to the same deductions that you had previously. So different ways to look at it, different things it could be. It might reveal the deductions directly. It might just simply be a deduction, or it could be a slightly different framing that leads to the same result. Now, here is an example of what a rule substitution question stem might look like. Again, by the way, these are typically, when these appear, they're going to be the final question of a game. Which one of the following, if substituted for the condition that A occurs immediately before or after B, would have the same effect in determining the order? So substituted is a key word there, obviously. Substituted, that's why we call them rule substitution questions, would have the same effect. Those are the keywords and phrases indicating you're dealing with this kind of question. So the key phrase here, that's the rule, is A and B must occur consecutively. That's the idea. So if A is immediately before or after B, that means they're occurring consecutively. Occurring consecutively is another way of framing that exact same idea. Obviously, this wouldn't be the answer because it's just a simple rephrasing, but you want to start thinking about how could you rephrase that idea. What that means, again, is that nothing else could go between the two. So if they said nothing goes between A and B, that's another way to say it. Appears different enough that for a very, very simple rule sub question, that might have been an answer. Typically, of course, they're going to be harder. I can't think of seeing one quite that easy, but that's the way you want to be thinking. What are the implications? What are the consequences? Now, if we had a game with a few different variables. Obviously, we're not just going to have two variables in a game. Let's suppose we had 5 variables, A, B, C, D, E. If we said none of C, D, or E could go between A and B, that would mean that that A and B must occur consecutively, because out of 5 variables, the other 3 aren't going in between A and B. So who's going between A and B? Nobody, meaning they are adjacent, they are side by side, they are consecutive in either order. That's the consequence. That's another way to frame it. And if you said none of C, D, or E could go between A and B, that would have the same effect, the same consequence, leading to the result that A and B were consecutive. And by the way, feel free to ask questions at any point. Just unmute yourself or type in the chat. I'm happy to address them as well as they come up. So here's a little drill, a little exercise. We've got 5 variables, A, B, C, D, E. And a question here. So we've got a question from Ariana asking, how does that rule account for A before B? Well, the rule was A is immediately before or after B. So it could be either order. Now I've set out, so I hope that addresses that question. Okay, cool, got it. She says got it. Okay, cool. So now here's a little setup, a little drill. Let's say we have the 5 variables, A, B, C, D, E. We're putting them in order. B is third, A is immediately before or after B, and D is before E. So I've just laid out part of that. I've laid out 5 slots. If B is third, plopping that down, 2 different possible layouts. A is immediately before B on slot 2, or A is immediately after B on 4. So A is on 2 or 4, and B is third no matter what. 2 different main diagrams, 2 different possibilities. Now, an inference that would result from this, and I just want you to start thinking about what are some potential inferences you gain from this. And I've pretty much laid it out. I've pretty much just said it inadvertently, actually. But I want you to start thinking about what are the consequences if these are the 2 routes you can go. Lots of inferences you might be able to gain here, but one of them would be simply A is second or fourth. And if we said A is second or fourth and removed, obviously, the rule in question, that would lead you to the same result. That would lead you to A being immediately before or after B. Different framing, different perspective, different tone, same exact result. Now, some other things you might want to think about, given that D is before E. If D is before E, that means E is never on 1 and D is never on 5 in either scenario. What that means is that you have very limited possibilities for what's happening on slots 1 and 5, no matter what. Meaning that either D or C is on 1 and C or E is last, just because there are so few variables in this drill. So imposing that constraint, if we said one of D or C is first and one of C or E is last, that would lead you to the point where A and B had to be consecutive. It wouldn't dictate the order. It could go either way. A could be on 2 or 4 on either side of B, but it would lead you to the point where A and B had to be consecutive. So again, the idea is you remove this second rule and you insert this instead. If you were to impose D or C is first and C or E is last, it would lead you to the idea that A and B were consecutive. There'd be no way around it. This is a little bit further removed from simply imposing the alternative rule sub that A is on 2 or 4. So that'd be a harder one. A on 2 or 4 is a little bit easier, given that we know initially B is on 3. But it's another way to get there as well. So here's a recap of all of those potential equivalent rules. Again, no other variables between A and B. That's probably a little bit too easy because it's using the exact same variables and nothing else. But technically, that would be a good rule sub. That would be a good equivalent rule. If we said none of C, D, or E could go between A and B, that would also be a way to get there. Still pretty easy, relatively speaking, but a little bit tougher maybe. A on 2 or 4. That's actually something I could see happening on a logic game as a correct answer. A on 2 or 4 would, again, lead to that consequence, but because it's referring to specific slots numbered rather than the adjacency or being consecutive or being immediate, it's a little bit tougher. I could see them asking that. And then that last one, D or C is first and C or E is last, is probably the hardest out of these 4. First 2 are basically just reframings. The other 2 are a little bit further removed. And of course, that last one's not even mentioning A or B at all. So a lot tougher, but gets you there too. And again, feel free to ask questions. Yeah, question? Heard somebody unmute themselves.
Oh, so Steve, this is Alana. So basically what you're doing here is you're kind of coming up with scenarios that could be like, these would be perhaps like answer choices, right? Like the stimulus would be, which of the following rules provides the same as B is third? And then these would be the equivalents, right? Like this would be like the examples that might be in the answer choices for this type of question.
Almost. I'm talking about the second rule though. A is immediately before or after B. I'm looking to substitute for that second rule.
Ah, okay. Yeah, well, I see what you're saying here. It just happens to, I see what I was thinking B was third because that's a different rule. Yeah, okay, so sometimes it's going to be that they're asking us to find the answer choice of like a rule that could help create the same kind of outcome. And other times they're going to ask us to apply a rule, right? A rule substitution. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in some logic games, the last question is going to be this equivalent rule or rule substitution question where they're asking us for something that is equal in consequence, identical in consequence, but is a different way to say it and maybe even looks completely different, but means the same thing. Kind of like 5 minus 3 is the same as 100 minus 98. They both get you to 2, but in very different ways. Or to go even one step beyond that, it could be like 2 times 1 also equals 2. That's multiplication versus subtraction, but it still gets you to the same end result. And so these 4 potential equivalent rules could all be correct answer choices for a rule substitution question. So you're not going to see all 4 of these. You're going to see one of them and then 4 other things that don't have an identical consequence.
I love that, identical consequence, because they really love to distract you with like super hard options.
Yeah. Yeah,
it's just like, nope, that's garbage. I want it identical.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, it's fun. Yeah, so identical consequence could be a good way to think about it. See some other questions in the chat here. Caleb is asking, when do we skip or address these in logic games? Well, ideally, you won't skip them. Ideally, after doing this lesson, this class, and working through a bunch of them in that list, you'll feel comfortable enough with them that you'd want to address them on the spot and feel comfortable doing so and getting it right. If you're totally at a loss, then sure, skip it. But then at that point, you're moving on to the next game already, because this is going to be the final question of the game. They always, any modifications, whether it's rule addition or subtraction, or most commonly these days, substitution, it's going to be the last question of the game. So do it last, regardless of when it appears. Now, if you're totally at a loss, yeah, you could skip it and go on to the next game, but then it's going to be hard to re-enter the world of a certain game, because when you do a game, you're taking the rules of that game and adding them to your short-term working memory. And so if you move on to the next game, coming back, you have to re-enter and reacquaint yourself with everything. It's going to be tough to get it at that point. So I'm going to say, if you're going to do it in the moment. And yeah, definitely attempt it. Games is the most perfectible section. Not going to say everybody gets them perfect all the time. Obviously not, but I would like you to try for it. And August LSAT is happening now, or just occurred for many folks. And so you've got at least a month before the October LSAT to get good at these. As for Andrew and Caleb, feel free to ask follow-ups on that. But Andrea is asking about reiterating what these are asking for. So I'll go back to what I said to Alana, where they're asking for something that's an identical consequence. So no more restrictive and no less restrictive means exactly the same thing, has exactly the same impact, just is phrased a totally different way, and may even have an indirect consequence. So here you see this last potential one isn't even mentioning the letters A or B. It's only mentioning C, D, E. But by imposing those restrictions, by saying both one of D or C is first and one of C or E is last, what you're saying then is that A is not going to go on slots 1 or 5. If it's not going to go on 1 or 5 and B is taking up slot 3, where is A left to go? On either 2 or 4, which is actually what the previous phrasing is telling us. So it's like these are increasing steps removed. This first one is about as close as you can get to that second rule without saying it directly. No other variables occur in between. That means they're consecutive, or A is immediately before or after B. They are adjacent, side by side, nothing else in between them, which is what the second one says. None of C, D, or E is in between A and B. So if nothing else is in between, and those are the only 5 variables, well, then A and B must be next to each other. Putting A on 2 or 4, well, if B is on 3, it's, again, side by side, and then that last one indirectly leads us to have A on 2 or 4. So these rule sub questions are asking you, again, for something with an identical consequence that is phrased very differently, but leads to the same result. Yeah, Andrew, if you have a question, feel free to just unmute yourself.
Hi, Steve. So I was just curious about the fully determined questions. Are those the same as the substitute questions as well, or are those 2 different types of questions?
Great question. Yeah, so fully determined is a totally different logic games question type. That's asking for which one of the following, or which one of the following variables, which one of the following, if inserted as an answer choice, would determine the placement of all variables, leaving no ambiguity at all. Those are actually pretty tough as well. They've appeared, I think, fairly consistently over the years since the beginning, so they're not a relatively recent addition to games the way that rule sub questions are, but they're pretty tough. They're pretty tough.
Another quick question. So basically the fully determined is like, it's giving us like a condition and saying like, okay, so if this was in this problem, what would allow it to like not can't like, I'm sorry, I can't phrase this. Like, what would allow it not to break any of the rules? Is that what it's saying? Like, so let's say, for example, they give you, okay, so if B was on Tuesday, what would make it fully determined? So is it trying to ask, like, even if they're giving us a condition, what is the answer that doesn't break any rules? Like, that keeps the game, like, you know what I'm trying to say?
Well, which doesn't break any rules?
So like, okay, can I read a question from like the book that I did today?
I don't want to go too far off track with the rule sub specifically, because it sounds like you're asking about a totally different logic games question type.
I just don't understand what the fully determined thing means. Like, that's just, I don't know.
So fully determined basically just means that you're limited to one specific scenario. So for example, I'll make one up right now about this drill that we've got on the page, and then I want to get back to the rule sub stuff, and we can cover the fully determined another time. But if, for example, if we learned that D was on 4, that would fully determine this scenario. Determine the scenario for these 5 variables. Because if D was on slot 4, we have D on 4, E on 5, because D is before E, leaving C to go on 1.
Okay.
So if we learned that as an answer choice, so they're asking which one of the following, if true, would fully determine the scenario. Let's say D on 4. D on 4, E on 5, C on 1. This scenario on the right, obviously A is taking up slot 4, so D is not going to go there. So if we learned D was on 4 as a local limitation, that would automatically mean we're in the scenario on the left. So we then end up with C, A, B, D, E as our listing of the 5 variables.
Okay, I get it. All right, I get it. Thank you so much.
Cool, of course, glad to help. I see Virginia's asking about are rule sub questions equivalent to rule addition and rule subtraction, or a different animal. So they're similar and different. I'm not going to say that they're equivalent because rule sub is asking for, again, identical consequence. Rule addition is adding a new rule to the original list. Rule subtraction, unlike rule substitution, rule subtraction is removing a rule. And these have appeared not that often over the years, but they've appeared occasionally a number of times. And I'll get to a slide with those a little bit later. they've appeared particularly in grouping in-out conditional games like Birds in the Forest and Fruit Stand. Both of those have that sort of thing. And I'll show some examples or list them a little bit later. So they're different, but like rule substitution, they appear last in the game, probably to avoid confusion around whether the new constraints might carry forward or not. The answer is they don't, but they don't want to confuse anybody around that. Cool. All right. It looks like folks are good on that one. Any other questions, feel free to ask. So I thought it'd be cool to look at an example of a rule sub question. This is the first one that ever appeared. Again, test 57, June 2009 LSAT, game 1, question 5. If you have it, if you have that access to that exam, please pull it up in your book or on Law Hub. It'll be the first game of that exam. Question number 5. It's got these 6 variables being placed in order. If you have it, take a few minutes to diagram and attempt that question, then we'll talk about it. If you don't have access to it for whatever reason, don't worry. We'll still be able to make sense of what's going on despite that. So I'm going to give everyone about 3 minutes to work on this one, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, it looks like some folks are done, so I'm going to start walking through that setup at least. So here's my initial setup of the question of the game as a whole. 6 slots, the rules H and G consecutive, K before G, M before L, and then M and J consecutive. So that's the initial rules just listed straightforwardly. Now, if we make some inferences, we can combine them, of course. So K is before G, and we have an HG block. Therefore, K is before both H and G as a block. K before the HG block. We also had M before L and J and M occurring consecutively in either order. So we can then say that the JM block or the MJ block, depending on which order it is before L. So combining, making inferences, good stuff. Now they're asking us, what is an equivalent rule to M being before L? So if we think about it, M is here, L is there, M is tied to J. So if we learned that J was before L, that would also mean M was before L, because you can't have L in between J and M or between M and J. So I'd be thinking then about J and how J relates to L. So a few possibilities. We could say L after M. That's pretty obvious, a little bit too easy maybe, right? Just saying, flipping it around. So they're not going to ask L after M. J before L, pretty good, because that's relating to the fact that M and J are consecutive in either order, of course. Or saying L after J, same meaning. These two mean the same thing. They just look different, kind of like how L after M is the same as M before L. So either one of these two would be a pretty good candidate. And of course, so that is the answer, in fact. Relating J before L, L after J, same thing. Any questions on this one? How are folks feeling about this one? Not too bad, right? I mean, they started with a relatively easier one at the beginning. The later exams get a little bit tougher over time, but that's a fairly decent starting point for these. So it looks like a decent number of folks got it. Some folks didn't have enough time. Yeah, I mean, these take some getting used to, so don't be discouraged if you had trouble with it to start. Everyone is at different speeds, so just practice it again. I've got that whole list of them to keep working on. As for a question about Chi-Chi's asking, is there a way to test it out that we got the right answer? Yeah, there is actually. And so you would see, do you end up with an identical main diagram? If you do, fantastic. You don't necessarily need to have an identical main diagram. It could look a little bit different in style or in what's actually listed there, but you want to see, do you get the same consequences as a result? So with this setup here, we have JM and MJ occurring consecutively in either order, of course, before L. So J and M are consecutive, either order before L. If we remove M before L, but we insert J before L or L after J, we end up with the same meaning. And in fact, that would actually look the same. So in that case, not too bad. It looks the same. That's great. Other cases, it may look a little bit different, but it means the same thing. But that would be a good test. And then the other tests, I would say, to go back a little bit earlier, I was saying about eliminating, using the previous diagrams. So eliminating answer choices that violate previous diagrams. If it's not compatible with the main diagram or local ones, eliminate it. So that's a way to test. Obviously, we're just jumping in with question 5 here. But if you were to go back and if you were to do this game in reality and go through all the other questions as well, this is just question 5. If you did 1 to 4, you would have your correct answer to the orientation question, number 1. You would have any local diagrams you had drawn up to that point as well. So maybe you're drawing scenarios for question 2 and question 3 and question 4. Maybe not all of those, but at least a couple. And so you'd be able to check, does L after J or whatever it was, does that violate or prevent any of those scenarios from working? If it does, then it couldn't possibly have an identical consequence. It must look a little bit different. And so it must have a different meaning. And so it would be out. On the flip side, if it allows previous scenarios, if it allows new scenarios that previously would not have worked otherwise, then it's too open-ended and also could not possibly be correct. And so I'm taking the more theoretical approach here just because we're jumping in with Q5. But if we had done this over the course of a full game, you'll see previous diagrams are often quite relevant. And so I put a few links in the chat, including a link to my video explanations for the majority of logic games. And when I'm working through the rule substitution questions in the context of an entire game, in those cases, you'll see I'm often looking back at the orientation questions answer and previous valid scenarios as well that I'd drawn locally to potentially help me knock out a couple of choices. And so Cheetah's commenting how she had looked at the JM block to start with, and that's fantastic. And so J and M in this game, they're pretty much equal in meaning. Obviously, they're not equal in terms of how we got there, but once we're there, we're there. And so the fact that especially if they could be in either order really helps them being equivalent. And so that's a good starting point to look at. Yeah, you want to see what is equivalent as a single variable as well, because then you can swap one variable for the other without really changing anything or without really losing anything at all. So I thought it'd be fun to then play with this a little bit and change it up. Or before I do that, I have a question from Bianca. So you do suggest that when we see rule substitution questions, we first look at just the rules. If that doesn't work, then the diagram. Yeah, I would say if you're feeling pretty good about rule substitution questions, then yeah, I would take the more theoretical approach to start. More theoretical meaning not just being tactical and looking at your scenarios, but looking at the initial setup and seeing from that, where could you go? What could you gain from that? If you see that J and M are basically the same thing, then that's the first place to start. Look at choices involving J. Then failing that, then I would go to the actual scenarios. Again, the rule orientation, correct answer, and then any local scenarios you've drawn over the course of the game. And yes, Andrea, if the substitution violates the original diagram, meaning it's not equivalent in meaning, if it prevents something from happening that could have happened before, then it's no good and you want to knock it out. Now, I was thinking that we could also think about equivalent rule to K before H. What would have the same meaning yet, or same consequence, but look a little bit different? H after K. Yeah, fantastic. Anything else? Nice. A lot of folks saying G after K. Yeah, G after K works as well because H and G are a block. You're not going to be able to insert K in between H and G. That's not possible because HG is a block. So if you say G is after K or K before G, it's going to end up with the same result. Can we also say G must have 2 before it? That's what Solomon's asking here. Anybody have an answer for Solomon on that?
I want to take a stab at this. I would
Sure.
say the reason it's a really close one, but we would have to add another variable in there to make it more concrete. It's a little bit too loose because it could have other variables mixed in. There's 5 spaces total. So we would need something else in there to tighten it up a little bit.
Nice. Yeah, fantastic, Alyssa. Great. So the K before HG block is a loose rule. So H and G are consecutive. That's tight. But K before the HG block is open-ended. So we don't really know how many variables will go between K specifically. So G having at least, so Solomon's modifying his suggestion to say at least 2 before it. So maybe saying something like K must be at least 2 spaces before K. How's that for a modification? So K is at least 2 spaces before G. Alyssa's saying if G had at least 2 variables before it, we still need to put K in there. Yeah, so we need to insert K specifically. So not just saying G must have 2 before it, but that in fact K is going at least 2 before G, which is then really another way of saying K before G while acknowledging the H. And yeah, it's tough to do this in your head. Yeah, so definitely write things down. And that's a good rule of thumb for games in general. I actually have a coaching session on the YouTube channel with a student talking about, she was trying to do games in her head and doing pretty well at it actually on the easier games, but then it falls apart on the tougher games. You can only go so far with that. And that's part of why it's really important to adopt the strategies, not just go about this blindly through aptitude alone, because what gets you through, let's say, the first 10 or so questions in logical reasoning or the easier logic games, that won't get you through to the tougher ones. At a certain point, that typically falls apart. Especially logic games, they're pushing beyond the limits of normal short-term working memory. And so if you're a memory champion doing things like memory palaces, that's fantastic. That's far beyond what most ordinary people are going to be doing. And so luckily, you have scratch paper. So make use of it. You get 5 sheets of scratch for the flex, meaning 10 pages because of double-sided. And for the normal digital LSAT, you get a booklet of 12 to 14 pages. And so plenty of space to diagram unless you have astronomically large handwriting. For most people, it's going to be more than enough. So use it. Use it. I actually shared something in the Facebook group recently, a layout of how I might organize my scratch paper. I've also got that same photo in the Logic Games Masterclass inside the course. And so if you're looking to see how I might lay things out, that's an example of it. Just one way, do what works for you, but use your scratch, write things down. Now here again is that list of, this is all in that article as well, of every rule substitution question that has ever appeared. We started with exam 57 and worked up from there. For those wondering what C2 is, that is super prep. So the super prep exams are A, B, and C. And then super prep 2 contains C2 and a couple of exams in the 60s, I think, 60, 61, 62, something thereabouts. But C2 is the only place to get it is the Super Prep 2 book. But that appears chronologically after 57. I'm just putting it there because of alphabetical numerical order. So I would say for most people, if you don't have C2, totally fine. You don't need it. Work from 57 going up. You'll see that they're skipping some. Exam 60 doesn't have any rule substitution questions. 67, 68 don't have either. Exam 71 has 2 of them. And 81 also has 2 of them. So they're sporadic. They're not every single time, but you could see fairly consistent. And for the future, who knows? That's why I got the question mark there. And also just to keep things kind of even there. The flex exams are undisclosed, so we don't know what's on those, but those are previously administered from the past as well. They're just continuing reusing those undisclosed ones. So that's the place to go for more practice. And Sarah's commenting in the chat, she was confused, then realized that she read one answer choice wrong. Yeah, that happens. Reading things wrong happens. Obviously, you want to be double checking, and then you just get burned enough times that you become more careful, but obviously everyone makes mistakes sometimes. So review and don't argue with the answer key. The answer key is almost never wrong. There's been a rare time or two, but we won't talk about that. Now, rule addition and subtraction questions. So this is a different variation on rule substitution where they are playing with the fundamental constraints of the game. So they do occasionally play. These are a couple of examples that come to mind just on a quick reflection on this. There may be others. I haven't exhaustively gone through all the exams looking for these specifically, but these are a couple of them. So 33 game 2 is that famous birds in the forest game. The last question of that game is a rule addition question. 33 game 4 isn't really that interesting, but it's about two sides of a street with houses, I think. And then 36 game 1 is the fruit stand game. Also a grouping in-out game with conditional chains like the birds in the forest game. So game 2, birds in the forest, is rule addition. 33 game 4 is also rule addition, and 36 game 1 is rule subtraction. Then in my unofficial game about a legislator voting on bills, the last question of that game, question 7, I also put in a rule substitution. I put in a rule addition question there, which is why it's on this slide. So here's the text of that question. We added in legislator voting for free trade, then voting against judicial activism. Then I made it must be true except. So kind of weird, but I had some fun playing around with it. And so in that particular game, F is a free variable, it's a floater. But now with this new rule, it actually relates logically with the initial main diagram, and we see what the consequences are. So I'm going to pull up the initial diagram, and then I'll pull up the modified diagram just to show you what that can look like once you add something in, just to show you how you might modify things a little bit. Here's my diagram for the rules of that game. If you haven't gotten to this, you'll get to it at some point. It's one of the games in the foundational section of the course. And so you see, this is a conditional in-out logic game. I think Gabby brought it up recently in a recent mastermind group coaching call. And so this was my initial diagram of that game. So you see, we've got lots of conditional statements. This is a tougher one, so don't worry if this is not making sense. I walk through it inside the course lessons. But initial diagram, you see, F is not here. F is listed as one of the initial variables of the game, but it's not, there are no rules about it, so we don't really know how it relates. Now, I'm going to then pull up the modified version where we add on that particular rule, which was basically saying F requires not J. So now F requires not J, J requires not F. Pretty simple. You just add it into the diagram like it was one of the fundamental games from the start. Now, for folks who want to practice this game, I've got a link to it I'm putting in the chat in just a moment. So for those of you who want to see it, it's there on the site. And then, of course, I have it inside the course as well. So rule addition, you just add it on. Rule subtraction, you just remove it. So if this were rule subtraction, I would chop that part out. I would chop that part out and back to normal constraints. Or let's say I were chopping out the rule that J requires I. I'll just chop out that part. I would cross it off maybe. Same over here. I would just cross it off like it never existed. And then obviously if you're modifying the fundamental constraints, you're changing all the inferences that follow. So now negative I would no longer require negative J or positive E, negative G, and so on. So you're really twisting all the inferences that you were initially dealing with in the first place. So very important to consider all those consequences. And yes, so Cheetah, I would save this for last, then add to the main diagram at that time. And like I said, for anything where they're modifying the fundamental rules of the game, it's going to be last. So rule addition is going to be last. Rule subtraction is also going to be last. They're never going to do it in the middle of the game. Rule substitution, always going to be last. So I wouldn't worry about that. I would just basically attempt things in the order given and then modify as necessary. So we've covered a lot here. Questions in general?
This wasn't really a question, but just a comment, Steve. With the question that you were just going over about this rule subtraction.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting thing. So I had never thought about rule subtraction. I'd only thought about like rule substitution or rule replacement, which I suppose could be subtraction or addition. But I realized that what you just showed us for subtraction is really helpful. It's like taking something away, but with addition, it's kind of like not even a rule subcategory. It's just a new rule. It's almost just like a new stimulus. Like if G is in 3, then blah, 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 right? So it feels like an addition would not be rule sub. It would just be a new rule.
Yeah, exactly. Rule addition is you're adding a new rule. So you got to pretend like that was a new rule all along, but you're limiting the scope of where you're applying it to that specific question. So you're basically making a new diagram where you're adding in that new rule and you're seeing all the consequences of that new rule.
Cool. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Of course. You want to remember, obviously, that does not address any of the other questions of that game. It's only for that specific question, but you're basically just drawing onto the main diagram. And you're seeing all the consequences that follow.
Hey, Steve, I had a question about, the rule substitution as well. So one question I had is, at times the examples will be some of the ones you showed us right now, which are sometimes relatively simple, but the other ones I see sometimes are like inferences. So I guess the question I was going to ask is, because typically, for example, they might have a rule substitution and it seems that there was an inference you're supposed to get at the beginning of the game. Let's say you find out that, legislative bills are only supposed to go on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but you just didn't get that inference for whatever reason. So I guess the question I had is, how do you go about, doing that with the limited amount of time if you didn't necessarily get that inference at the beginning of the game? Is there a way to sort of reverse engineer that to sort of, work your way through that problem?
Yeah, you get it from your previous valid scenarios. So all the scenarios you've drawn up to that point, they may indirectly reveal the inference where you see, actually, you know what? It turns out that C always happens on Wednesday. It's just funny how that always seems to happen. Can I avoid putting C on Wednesday? And if it turns out that it's not possible to ever make a valid scenario where C is somewhere else, then it's probably the case that C has to be on Wednesday, and there you have your answer. I'm talking about inferences in general here because that's what you're asking about. But it's possible. I would be thinking about. So here's the thing with inferences. Inferences often result from the combination of multiple rules. So you've got to see how a given rule actually interacts with another rule in order to get you there. It's all contextual with examples, really, which is why I was thinking that even just doing full games and looking at my explanation videos where I'm walking through all of these examples, there you're seeing tons of examples of me walking through rule sub questions, and I'm walking through them in context of a full game. So you'll see how I'm trying to be as efficient as possible using those previous scenarios. And so I'm saying that's where you go if you don't get it at the start.
That makes sense. I guess just a quick follow-up question I was going to ask. Would you say, I guess, the majority of the of these rule substitute questions are the ones, I guess, that you showed us in the previous examples, or would you say there's sort of like a mixture in terms of the inferences versus, maybe just the rule itself and expressing it in a different formal way?
I'd say it's a mixture. I mean, the examples I showed here were definitely on the easier side. They do get harder than that, but I just kind of did this to pave the way to get you started.
Got you. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Anything else, questions or reflections on this? See, Alana's got her hand raised. Maybe that was from before.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. All right, folks. Well, if nothing else, we could leave off here. Again, the recording will be inside the course within a couple of days. The student study group is happening in 10 minutes, but obviously feel free to join now. And I would suggest walking through some rule sub questions, but you could also work through other stuff too if you like. But anyway, folks, thanks for joining. Obviously, more coming soon. If you have any questions or comments or feedback, please reach out. I'm always happy to take your ideas into consideration for future classes. Have a good night, all.